Now we come to the portion of the talk that I suspect most of you have been waiting for, and this is the section on disease control. There are a variety of strategies that you can use to help prevent and control diseases. One of the major categories is something called cultural control. These are a variety of techniques that you use. You basically change how you grow your plants or how you select your plants, and these sorts of techniques will then lead to fewer problems with diseases. One of the big categories under cultural control is something called avoiding pathogens. What you're trying to do is simply prevent the introduction of disease-causing organisms into your landscape. One of the ways that you can do this is to make sure if you're growing plants from seed that you buy the seed from a reputable source. What do I mean by reputable? Sometimes that's very, very difficult to determine. What I tend to do when I'm buying seed is I try to find out where the seed was produced. I usually want the seed to be produced in a very, very arid region of the world, either in the United States or elsewhere. You just want it to be grown in a place where the producers are forced to water their plants. And the reason why you want the seed produced in a really dry environment is because that tends to cut down on the possibility of bacterial pathogens. If you produce seed in an environment like we have in Wisconsin or in the upper Midwest, it tends to be a relatively wet environment, and if you look at the seed that's produced in that environment, you tend to pick up a lot of bacterial pathogens. If you're buying whole plants, make sure you inspect those plants very carefully before you purchase them. You want to take a look at the leaves to see if you see any indication of fungal leaf spots, bacterial leaf spots, any indication of viral pathogens. If you're buying one of those 6-packs of plants, I would pop out some of the plants and take a look at the root system in order to make sure that there's no browning in the roots that might be indicative of a root rot problem. Again, you want to bring healthy plants into your yard or your landscape. You also want to check out the plants for any insect activity. Insects can certainly cause problems on their own, but they also are important because they can move disease-causing organisms around. We certainly talked about this in the context of viral pathogens, phytoplasma pathogens, and also there are certain examples of bacterial pathogens and even fungal pathogens that can be moved around by insects. So again, you want plants that you're bringing into your yard to be insect-free. You also want to make sure you keep weeds under control because weed species oftentimes can serve as alternate hosts for disease-causing organisms. Particularly, I think of this in the context of viral pathogens. And then finally, sometimes you have to be a little bit careful about your water source, particularly if you're using something like pond water. Pond water potentially can be a source of pathogens because that water comes into contact routinely with soil, and soil is a great source for a lot of different types of pathogens, particularly root rot pathogens. Now, if you're using pond water to water right now and not having any problems, don't worry about it. But if you start to see an increase in disease problems, particularly root rot problems, I would certainly consider, if you're using pond water, that as a potential source of the pathogen. Another thing that you can do to help avoid diseases is to avoid favorable environmental conditions. We've talked a little bit about this during the course of the presentation, and one of the things you have a fair amount of control over is soil moisture. Make sure you're not overwatering. This certainly is not an issue in my yard or in my home. I tend to underwater. But a lot of folks tend to apply excessive water, and when you do that, you can increase the likelihood of root rot diseases. Also, if you get a lot of moisture on leaves, you can increase the likelihood of things like fungal leaf spots and bacterial leaf spots. Also, you want to make sure that you do not have high humidity around plants because that tends to be more favorable for a variety of fungal diseases. In particular, we talked about this in the context of powdery mildews. And again, the way that you reduce humidity in a garden is, one, if you're planting a new garden, space those plants far apart. And two, if you've got an existing garden where you've got a lot of plants packed close together, you want to thin those plants. That increases airflow between plants, and that tends to move out any of that humid air that can develop around the plant leaf surface. Another sort of environment that you can modify to gain at least some disease control is nutrition. Make sure your nutrition is balanced. You don't want to have nutrients too high or too low. Plants that are under nutrient stress tend to be more susceptible to infection. Plants that get too much of a particular nutrient, in particular something like nitrogen, tend to produce a lot of foliage. That makes a nice, thick, very dense plant that tends to trap a lot of moisture. And again, that modifies the environment to make the environment more conducive to fungal and bacterial diseases. There are even some types of diseases where if you have two nutrients that are within their normal ranges but kind of out of whack relative to one another, that can lead to an increase in disease. We talked about that in the context of corn stalk rots. Also, you want to make sure that you don't put your plants under a lot of water or heat stress. In general, plants that are under a lot of stress tend to be more prone to infection. So you want to make sure things are watered properly. Wherever possible, you want to make sure that plants are protected so they don't get cold injury or don't get too hot so that they get heat injury. That injured tissue tends to be a great entry point for a variety of different types of disease-causing organisms. Also, be kind of aware of what's going on in the vicinity of your yard or garden. In particular, if you have neighbors that use a lawn care service where the lawn care service is applying herbicides on a routine basis, be aware of that, because if you know when these folks are coming to make an application, if you have particularly sensitive plants near the lot line or even farther into your yard, you can cover those plants to help prevent exposure just in case there's an accidental drift of those products onto your property. Sanitation is also a very important type of cultural control. We've talked about the fact that whenever you're using tools, they can become contaminated with disease-causing organisms, and you need to decontaminate or disinfest the tools routinely. What we normally use for metal tools is something like 70% alcohol. You can also use 10% bleach, although that tends to be a little bit corrosive on metal tools. If you're interested in using alcohol, you can use something like rubbing alcohol. Also, a lot of the spray disinfectants contain about 70% alcohol by volume, and you can spray those on your tools, allow them to air dry, and then you're ready to go. You also need to make sure that anything else that comes into contact with diseased plants or soil is decontaminated as well. In terms of pots, if you're using clay pots or ceramic pots, I recommend washing those to get rid of the excess soil, and then you can soak those for 20 to 30 minutes in a 10 to 20% bleach solution, and then you rinse the pots afterwards to remove any of the bleach residues, and then you're ready to go. If you're dealing with plastic pots, you can also try this bleaching technique. However, if you've had an issue with a root rot problem, then I think you're probably better off just disposing of those plastic pots. There's been some work that indicates that if you're dealing with root rot pathogens like Pythium, if you try to bleach pots that have been contaminated with that organism, it just doesn't work particularly well. You should also decontaminate work surfaces. For benches, if you're talking about a wood bench or some sort of countertop, 10% bleach works really, really well. You do need to be careful when you're using that, not to get it on your clothing because it will eat holes. Also, if you are using some sort of soil, it should be a pasteurized type of soil. Pasteurization is just a process where steam is passed through the soil for a particular period of time, and that heat and moisture will help eliminate pathogens in the soil mix. You do need to check the bag though, because not all potting mixes have been pasteurized. Also, if you're a person who likes to water plants and then collect any of the runoff and reuse that runoff needs to be decontaminated, because as that water flows through soil, it can pick up things like root rot pathogens, and if you use that and don't decontaminate it, you can actually inoculate other plants as you water. The best way to do that would be to simply boil the water, or you could microwave it to get it heated up. That's the best way, I think, for a homeowner to decontaminate water. If you're working in a greenhouse setting, there are methods where you can chemically treat water, you can filter water. There are also UV irradiation techniques to decontaminate recycled water. If you see diseased plants and it's a relatively serious disease, say some sort of root rot or some sort of vascular disease, then I do recommend removing those plants and getting them out of your yard. I typically recommend taking those to some sort of commercial composting operation where they can be treated through a heated compost process, and that helps eliminate pathogens from that material. With leaf spot sorts of diseases, I don't think you necessarily need to remove diseased plants, but with some of the more serious diseases, yes, I think your best option is removal. Also, when you're growing plants, they are going to naturally lose leaves and flowers as those plant parts age. It's very important to remove those plant parts very quickly as they decline, because as that plant tissue weakens, it tends to be more prone to infection. In particular, there's a fungus called botrytis. It causes a disease called gray mold, and that particular organism is not really great at infecting really healthy, vigorously growing plant tissue. But where it can get into a plant is on leaves that are beginning to senesce or naturally age. And also, it's very easy for this organism to get in through petals that have begun to wither. Oftentimes, I see this organism in greenhouse settings where you'll see a spot of infection on a leaf, and if you look at the top of that leaf, there's a little withered petal that has fallen onto the leaf surface. Once that kind of dead tissue from the petal is there, the fungus is able to infect that, and once it has that food source from that petal, it becomes a much more aggressive pathogen and is able to penetrate the healthier leaf tissue underneath. Another major category of plant disease control is chemical control, and this involves the application of chemicals, typically called fungicides or bactericides, to plants in order to prevent disease. In general, the fungicides and bactericides fall into two major categories. There are the so-called protectant fungicides and bactericides. These are products that you spray over the top of the plant, and they basically form a chemical layer on the surface of the plant. This prevents infection. These products are not absorbed into the plant, so really good uniform coverage by these products is critical for them to provide good control. If you're really sloppy in terms of your application and don't get upper surfaces, lower surfaces of leaves, stems, all coated with these products, if you've got areas where the product has not been applied, those missed areas can still become infected. The other major group of fungicides and bactericides are the systemic products. These are products that when you apply them, they are absorbed into the plant tissue and are at least locally redistributed within the plant. And so you don't have to be quite as uniform in terms of coverage with the systemic products, and you can still get control. Now, I don't want you to think that you should be sloppy as you're applying these, because even with the systemic products, if you get them more uniformly applied, you're going to get better control. Another category of chemical control products are the so-called fumigants. As a homeowner, you're probably never going to use these, but you should be aware of them. These products are typically applied to soil. They are general biocides, that is, they pretty much kill anything that's biological on contact. So they will kill disease-causing organisms, they will kill beneficial organisms in soil, they will kill insects, worms. If you expose plants to them, they will kill those plants. You can also, if you expose people or animals to them, you can kill those organisms as well. So these are pretty nasty products. And the reason why as a homeowner you're not going to encounter these very often is that you have to have a special certification in order to apply these products. And so you have to go through special training in order to use these. I typically recommend chemical control as the control of last resort. I would much prefer folks to try the cultural methods that I've discussed as the primary methods for disease control. The main thing to keep in mind if you do decide to use some sort of fungicide or bactericide is that you really need to be using the right product for the right situation. So you want to make sure that whatever product that you select is the right product to control the disease that you want to control. You also want to make sure that that particular product is labeled for use on the particular plant that you want to treat. Now, this becomes really an issue when you're dealing with fungicides and bactericides that are labeled for use in agricultural settings. You really have to look at the label, and if you want to apply that product to soybeans, you have to make sure that soybeans is listed on the label as a particular plant that you can apply that product to. The ornamental labels are typically much more broadly written. Oftentimes it'll say you can use this on herbaceous plants or woody ornamentals or evergreens, or you can use this in landscape settings or in greenhouse settings. So a much broader label gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of your ability to use the products. But again, you need to have the right product to control the right disease, and you need to have the right product that's labeled for the plant that you want to treat. The bottom line here is that you want to use these products safely. So definitely when you buy a fungicide or bactericide, make sure that you read the entire label that's on the product that you buy. There's a lot of important information on not only how to use the product in terms of amounts and when to apply it, but also how to apply it safely. There's going to be a particular section on safety on that label. It'll talk about things including personal protection equipment. So that's the type of clothing you need to wear when you're applying the product. Oftentimes for homeowner sorts of products, it's something like long pants, long sleeve shirt, hat, maybe a mask of some kind, gloves, but that'll all be on the label. Also, it will include something called a re-entry interval. That's how long you have to wait after you've made the application before you can safely go back in and handle your plants without suiting back up, wearing that clothing again. And then if you're applying the product to some sort of edible crop, there will also be a treatment to harvest interval on the label that'll tell you how long after the last application you need to wait before you can safely harvest the edible part of that plant and consume it. We don't have a lot of time to talk about chemical control during this presentation, so I think it's very important that if you're going to routinely use fungicides and bactericides that you get additional training. And certainly in Wisconsin, county extension offices provide what's called pesticide applicator training. This training is really designed for folks who want to apply chemicals as part of a business for, say, disease control or insect control. But I really think the training is very, very good even for homeowners. You don't have to get the certification. You can just take the training and learn all kinds of things about how to use pesticides and how to use them safely. So I think it's well worth the time and the money. And again, the whole idea here is the more you learn about how to use these products, the safer you're going to be as you apply them. The last of the major categories of plant disease control is biological control, and I include in this particular category something called disease resistance, which many folks would actually break out as one of the major groups. Disease resistance, though, is really biological in nature. What you do is you observe individuals of a particular kind of plant. You look for those individuals that are less likely to come down with a particular kind of disease, and then you take a subgroup of the population, interbreed that to develop a variety or a cultivar that's less likely to succumb to a particular disease problem. This technique has been quite useful. It's used extensively for controlling diseases of agricultural crops, but even for home gardeners, you can find disease-resistant things like vegetables. Particularly if you're growing something like cucumbers, you can find powdery mildew resistant cucumbers or squash plants. If you grow things like roses, oftentimes those plants, because they're very, very popular, have been bred for resistance to powdery mildews, to black spot, and to other types of diseases. The downside to disease resistance is that sometimes when you're breeding for these resistance characteristics, you lose other types of characteristics, things like flower color or leaf size, leaf shape, that are really what people are looking for in terms of how the plant looks. So sometimes it can be a trade-off. You end up with a plant that's resistant but doesn't have quite the look or flower color that you're really looking for. The more classic type of biological control is what I call the biological pesticides. I really don't see these compounds as being that fundamentally different than the chemical pesticides that I talked about previously, except that the active ingredients in these products are some sort of natural product. Some of the products that are biological pesticides will contain plant extracts. I think the classic example of this is something called neem oil, where the active ingredient is the oil of the neem tree. Other types of biological pesticides will have certain types of bacteria or fungi as the active ingredient. Probably the classic examples of some of these fungi or bacteria containing biological pesticides are ones that are used for controlling root rots, particularly in nursery settings or greenhouse settings where you're using potted plants and you can apply these products to the potting mix before you pot up your plants. Sometimes I get into discussions with folks about whether biological pesticides or chemical pesticides are better. Some people really think that because a biological pesticide has a natural ingredient that it's better. I don't normally think that way. What I think about is which product is most effective for disease control and which active ingredient is the safest. Because there are certain examples of biological chemicals. These are naturally produced chemicals that are quite toxic. Botulism toxin is an example of that. A natural product, but really, really a nasty chemical. For an example a little bit closer to home, there was a colleague of mine who was working on a fungal isolate that provided relatively good control of apple scab, and he was interested in commercializing it until he did some toxicological work on the organism and found out that this fungus produced a very potent carcinogen. So again, when you're looking at biological pesticides versus chemical pesticides, really evaluate how safe is the product and is it the most effective product for the particular disease that you want to control.